Emails leaked in Climategate 1 and 2 show a contempt for peer review and a realization that their data doesn't support their conclusions without being fudged.
So, that seems perfectly okay.
But there's an American side to this story as well, one involving Michael Mann, who gave us a famous hockey stick.
Policies not just at the national, state, and local, but international level are being promoted in the name of catastrophic man-made global warming, and the hockey stick had served as, quote, the smoking gun.
Now, if you'll bear with me, I want to really emphasize this point.
As in the UK, American climate scientists are fighting to hide research data paid for by taxpayers and being used as a basis for public policy. Powerful men seeking to elevate themselves by global transference of wealth through carbon credits and other schemes is no laughing matter, but threatens to destroy untold wealth, jobs, and opportunity.
I'd just like to have some of those gold bars.
American Tradition Institute, restoring science, accountability, and liberty to the environmental policy debate.
Here we are at the University of Virginia, Mr. Jefferson's university, the same Mr. Jefferson who wrote about not climate change, but global warming in his notes on the state of Virginia, 1781, in which he noted the Earth used to be covered by snow about 3 months in every year. The rivers used to freeze over, as his friends in Europe were telling him of warming on the continent at a rate of 1 degree per century by Mr. Fahrenheit's thermometer, which was not at the time placed on airport runways, where our sages have moved them now to identify a surface warming. Mr. Jefferson was an observer. He was a climatologist of the day, I suppose. He was many things, but he was not an alarmist. He was not trying to blame his neighbor for the weather. Mr. Jefferson was a diarist. But that's changed, and now alarmism is in fashion, and people are blaming their neighbor for the weather and claiming that whatever happens, it must be man. And the University of Virginia finds itself at the epicenter of the global warming alarmist movement and indeed the global warming industry. Policies in the United States and throughout the world have been driven by the climate issue, or what began as the global warming issue, the idea of catastrophic man-made global warming. There was this aberrant warming in the 20th century and man caused it, and there's no other explanation. Well, this movement had what it hailed as the smoking gun, called the hockey stick, which appeared to great acclaim in a UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. Well, a few years passed, and after some efforts to stonewall inquiry to perform what you might consider real peer review or science, which it turned out later the hockey stick really hadn't undergone, there was a leak out of the University of East Anglia in the United Kingdom of some records that had been subject to FOIA requests for 4 years, all of which had been stonewalled, and met with a series of changing rationale. You can't have these records because you don't meet this new criteria I've invented. You can't have these records because you don't meet this other criteria. Well, after about 4 years, somebody wrote and said, I meet all of your new artificial criteria, please give me these records. This resulted in a response, essentially the dog ate it. We lost the data. This appears to have been a last straw for somebody internally because about 1,000 emails, what the posting party said was a random selection of emails, computer code, and annotations to computer code, appeared on a Russian server. Now, there's no evidence in the record that they were hacked or stolen. They were leaked, and apparently by a whistleblower. Even some alarmists will acknowledge that. Well, one data set was essentially withdrawn as a result of Climategate because they said, we've lost the data, we can't support it. But there was also a lot of discussion in these leaked emails about this hockey stick, and that included efforts to derail inquiry or challenge. It included support for what many people had said, and I wrote a book about Red Hot Lies, that peer review had been corrupted, had been perverted in climate science. It was really PAL review. So we saw a lot of affirmations, again affirming suspicions that many of us had. But it was in the principles, at the highest levels of the global warming industry's own words.
On the 21st of January 2005, when you said you aren't going to make the data available to him because all he wants to do is find something wrong with it. That's the nature of scientific pursuit, isn't it?
Yes, I've obviously written some very awful emails, and I fully admit that.
But that's very clear.
Yes, it is.
It's absolutely clear denial of this man's attempt to get at what you were doing.
It was in the principals at the highest levels of the global warming industry's own words. It was not out of context. It was in full context with no editorialism.
There was also an American side to Climategate. 15% of Climategate 1 emails involved Michael Mann.
Mr. Mann was at the University of Virginia during part of the time. In fact, about 150 of the Climategate emails were sent to or from Michael Mann accounts at the University of Virginia on the University of Virginia system, paid for by the taxpayer, therefore owned by the taxpayer. Several parties began seeking more to add context. Because remember, what we're being told is, well, there have been inquiries, there have been investigations, and these people have been exonerated for what appears to have been revealed or affirmed in Climategate. What we wanted to do was add context to Climategate. Let's just say it was supposedly out of context. It was just dots on a piece of paper. This would fill in the canvas. This would complete the picture that Climategate does appear to have painted. A state legislator asked for these records. He was told by the University of Virginia that as a matter of policy, when Mr. Mann left, having moved on to his own research center at Penn State after the hockey stick, why they destroyed the records. But Greenpeace asked for another scientist in the same department's records, emails and so forth, and the university responded very differently. Although Pat Michaels had also left the department, UVA said, sure, here's what it'll cost you. So the question is, which is your policy? Dr. Michaels had left the department. Your line with Mr. Mann was, well, he left, ergo, we destroyed them. Why didn't you destroy Pat Michaels' records? Well, it turns out they hadn't destroyed Michael Mann's records either when a law enforcement officer got involved, the Attorney General of Virginia, in a pre-investigation under the Fraud Against Taxpayers Act in Virginia. When Ken Cuccinelli, the AG, asked for these records, the university acknowledged that they had located them. They said they found them on a backup server, but they did not want to turn them over.
Well, the issue of Michael Mann on the UVA grounds has been incendiary, and one that, quite honestly, I'm sure UVA would wish would go away. We coined the phrase, getting their Nixon on, because it just seemed to be that they were hell-bent on becoming one of the all-time American cover-ups as they continued to deny anyone access to even look at what Michael Mann had done. When they had finally cornered themselves in their own hypocrisy over whose emails exist and whose don't, they realized they had no choice. But yet they still seem to be able to try to find new and innovative ways to continue to get their Nixon on. At some point, I have a feeling the emails will actually include 18 and a half minutes of blank space.
The university officials subsequently said, we had planned to cooperate with this law enforcement officer's pre-investigation under a Fraud Against Taxpayers Act, but, well, there was a pressure campaign put against us, and therefore we decided to respond to it favorably and obstruct, that is, or at least not comply.
If they owned up to it, said, hey, this is what we thought, this was what everyone was telling us was good, let's wash our hands of it, I think they'd be fine. But this immediate lawyering up, as soon as their lawyer, the Attorney General for the Commonwealth, says, I just need to look at some documents, because if somebody comes after us for this Fraud Against Taxpayer Act case, I need to know if we can defend ourselves. And they immediately said, you have no rights to those. As the lawyer for the Commonwealth, he is, through a couple of steps, the university's main lawyer. And they told him you can't see it. I mean, to me, that's the most ridiculous point in this.
So the university spent what is now about $500,000 of what they say is private donations to defend against releasing to the taxpayer, to a law enforcement officer working for the taxpayer, records the taxpayer paid for and are owned by and possessed by the taxpayer, the University of Virginia, which relies on taxpayer support to exist.
The University of Virginia is claiming that this is an academic freedom issue, but what I see it is a taxpayer freedom issue. And so if the taxpayers are paying for this information, if they're supporting this organization, there was no presumption of secrecy or privacy going into it, there's no reason in the world why they should not release those documents to the public.
After having attended oral argument here in Albemarle County and heard the university say to the court, yes, we have in fact located these records, we decided to ask for them under the Freedom of Information Act. Because again, under the Freedom of Information Act, in Virginia, public records are public, barring a specific exemption. No exemption appears to apply to an academic's emails. In fact, the University of Virginia is expressly covered under the Virginia Freedom of Information Act. So we applied, asked for the records. They were due us in 5 days. After 5 days, the university said we're allowed to ask for 7 more days. After 7 more days, they said this is really time-consuming and will be very expensive, and therefore we would like to impose a fee of $35,000, I believe, if we read your request in a way it's not written. Of course, if we read it the way it's written, it would be $8,500.
Despite the exorbitant amount, ATI agreed to pay the $8,500 and has paid the majority of those fees while still awaiting the data.
After 3 months, we were told that records would begin to be produced soon. We were told 4 more weeks. We were told we will begin producing records in 3 days. Not 2, not 4, not 6, 3 days. 2 weeks later, it was pretty clear they weren't going to produce any records, and we filed suit, demanding the records, seeking to compel the university to produce what the taxpayer owned, what the taxpayer institution now acknowledged possessing, for the taxpayer to see, because to claim this is not in the public interest is, of course, absurd.
The treatment of Chris and the American Tradition Institute and their request to do nothing more than, as taxpayers, see the very documents that the Attorney General was concerned with seeing in the first place, I think tell you everything you need to know about it.
Why do you directly contradict yourself in the testimony you're giving about this scientific question?
The last paragraph in that section was not a paragraph which I wrote. That was added to my testimony.
If they force you to change a scientific conclusion, it's a form of science fraud by them.
But isn't it also fraud when scientists and universities alter and hide data to further a political agenda under pressure from other scientists and politicians?
In fact, another pressure campaign had been instituted against them. Now, disappointingly, in its response to us, the university waved away this pressure campaign as being just in our minds. And then they proceeded in the same document to refer to the pressure campaign as further reason why the court shouldn't compel UVA to turn over the records. In fact, they had referred to this pressure campaign and asking the court to not allow the Attorney General to compel production of these records. So we filed. The university was not thrilled with that, but they did realize they had to go to court and defend the history of what I've just described. So the night before we were to go to court, they agreed. This is very important. Those people who don't like that we're asking for these records have a problem with the law. And they have a problem with the University of Virginia complying with the law. Because UVA, reading the statute, agreed to produce the records, and they agreed to produce them by date certain. Well, that was in May. Time passed. They produced a small tranche of the records that day, claiming we were going to produce these today all along. It's very unfortunate you sued us, and so on. And then they produced, as required under the agreed order approved by the court, they produced another tranche a few weeks later, and they were due to produce the rest, which they were claiming to be exempt under the Freedom of Information Act, and they would have to say why they're exempt. They agreed, under the order approved by the court, pursuant to the Virginia Freedom of Information Act, to produce the rest of the records under protective order. Well, for 3.5 months, Michael Mann responded by giving interviews to the media and otherwise conducting a public affairs campaign, and presumably, I don't know this, working with the pressure campaign, which was really ratcheting up against the university, as they acknowledged to us privately several times. UVA has made clear to us that they find themselves in a very difficult position with their faculty. And we've pointed out to them that this difficult position they find themselves in is between their faculty and the law. And we are taxpayers, and we don't sympathize. The law is what it is, and it says what it says, and they have to abide by this. Well, they agreed to produce the records. And then 13 days before the records were to be produced under this order, 3.5 months after the order, Mr. Mann then served us saying, I need to intervene. This is very, very important to me. First Amendment rights, property interest, privacy interest, other things that simply aren't true.
It wasn't too long ago that the University of Virginia fired one of their employees for using their email account, their University of Virginia email account, to send out private emails. So you can't have it both ways. If the University of Virginia says this is private, then why didn't they fire Michael Mann? If it's not private, then they need to release the information.
And that is where, as we speak today, we find ourselves. But that is why we're seeking these records, and that is to provide the background to Climategate, which was not a flash in the pan. It shows the public responded. It really did scratch an itch many people felt. They rightly suspected that there was a lot of the argument behind the climate movement that didn't withstand scrutiny. Generally, when these movements are premised in we must act now, or even as the climate extremists do argue, essentially do what I want or everyone dies, that it probably is a good time to sit back and give it the hard look. But the hard look is something the global warming movement has fought for years tenaciously, and I suggest seeking to block these records that the taxpayer owns and is owed, barring an exemption, none of which seem to apply, is just a continuation of this effort to keep the information from the taxpayer.
To learn more, visit our website and sign up. And, if possible, support our effort by making a tax-deductible contribution to our effort to restore accountability to taxpayer-funded work.